Do you remember, I didn't get his name, maybe you might remember his name. Do you remember the American teenager who was living in Singapore at the time, and he thought it would be pretty funny to go and vandalize cars? Do you remember that several years ago? Some yes, some no. But you might also remember that the Singapore government didn't think it was quite as funny. And in Singapore, the punishment for such a crime is what they call caning, which is taking a bamboo cane, and that's where you get your lickings, all right? And I remember that the U.S. government tried to intervene and because the parents asked them, and obviously that's unusual for those of us who live in America, and some of us might agree with some of that, the punishment might fit the crime. But regardless, if I remember correctly, the U.S. government tried to intervene, was unable to stop that, and I think he got his lickings. Okay? Amen. What he learned there was a valuable lesson in what's called jurisdiction. So you can have someone who is a police officer in the state of Hawaii, and if they're on vacation in the state of California, they can't walk around, or they can't go around pulling people over for speeding. Now, I'm oversimplifying a little bit. There is some shared jurisdiction between states and things like that. But basically, that person has been given power to exercise authority in a certain area. You get outside of that area, and power and authority does not exist there, much like the U.S. government to another country. That's why whenever I'm traveling through Singapore, I try to fight the temptation to vandal and spray paint cars. I would like to get back to the U.S. to do that. And that's because I'm outside of the U.S. Government protection. As God's people, as Christians, we enjoy the blessing of living under God's jurisdiction. Under His protection, under His power, we also have responsibility as citizens of God's kingdom. I want to give you 3 ways this morning to live under God's protection. I hope that's something that we're all hungry for, that we all desire. Maybe you're not in a struggling place right now, but if you're in one of those places, it's like, oh, I so wish God had God's protection. I want to give you 3 ways to remain in God's protection this morning. John chapter 17, verse 15. We'll put the verses on the screen for you. Jesus asked for spiritual protection from God for His followers, for His apostles. He prayed, "My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one." Now notice that this is not for a prayer for complete protection from all physical harm. It's not protection from all physical struggle. But what he's saying is, because if it is, then his prayer failed. Because we know that all those he was praying for, specifically his apostles, all, at least in Scripture or through church history, we know that all but one was executed because of their faith. Often violent deaths. As long as we are in the physical world, we're going to have physical struggles that come to us. Satan is going to attack us. He's been allowed a certain sense of power. Now, he doesn't have any exact power. We'll talk about this during our Bible study time. People have to loan him their hands and their mouths for Satan to do his work. Unfortunately, there are the times where even we, and certainly other people, participate and partner with him. We loan him our hands to do evil. We loan him our mouths to do evil. And he has a certain level of power because of that. Certainly we would see that he has a certain level of power for a limited scope and a limited time. But we know that he does. As long as we're in the physical world, we're going to have spiritual struggles that come at us. But we will always have spiritual protection. We will always have spiritual protection. Now, sometimes spiritual protection shows itself in physical protection. You've heard stories about that. You have stories about that. We have in our congregation stories where the belief is that, no, God physically protected or spared someone because they should have died in that accident. They should have been killed by something, and God protected them. But the guarantee is, what we know is, the promise is for spiritual protection. So while Satan does have limited power to attack you, to harm you, to oppress you, take heart in the fact that God does not allow Satan the power to defeat you spiritually, ever. We feel close sometimes, don't we? But that's the promise of God. Paul writes the same encouragement to the Christians in Thessalonica. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 3. He says, "But the Lord is faithful." See, his faithfulness is never in question, right? The Lord is faithful, and he provides 2 things. He will strengthen you, and he will protect you from the evil one. Again, understand that it's not about complete physical protection. Sometimes that exists. But it is complete spiritual protection. Satan does not. God, and finally, what happens is, if we're in the boxing ring, we're kind of taking some punches, all right? But God says at some point, if Satan ever seems to be getting too close, getting the best of us spiritually, God steps in and says, that's enough. Yes, you have a certain amount of power. You have a certain amount of freedom here on earth, because that's the battle that we're in. But take no doubt that I have defeated you. One day, that reality will come to fruition. But in the meantime, yes, you might get a punch in on my children, but at some point I say, that's enough. He will never let our faith in God be defeated, ever. The Lord is faithful. He will strengthen and protect you from the evil one. See, struggles in life aren't necessarily signs of unfaithfulness. We have to be very careful with that. Sometimes we look and say, oh wow, well, if God's blessing is protection and someone seems to be attacked, I go, oh, they must not be living under God's protection. What's going on? If you know the story of Job, you know that Job was not attacked by Satan because of his lack of faith or his weak faith. In fact, what made him a target of Satan was his great faith. So we have to be real careful being judgmental as far as that. Sometimes it can be one way, sometimes it can be on the other side. But what we know, even what was true for Job was, you may not steal his faith. God is always going to be our defender, our shield person when it comes to matters of spirituality and faith. Basically, this is what spiritual protection is. Even if Satan lands a punch, and all he does sometimes, doesn't he? Even when Satan lands a punch, he is unable, by God's sovereign protection over his people, he is unable to knock you out. You might experience attack and struggle and difficulty, but under God's jurisdiction, where he has sovereign power and authority, there is spiritual protection for his people. So point number one, God protects his people. So what's the application to that? Be sure you're one of his people. Alright? There's a story out of Deuteronomy, I think it was, where God's people, like all God's people always, you know, that's the whole story of the Bible. It's still the story of God's people today. They get close to God, and then they go away from God. God calls them back, and they come back and be faithful. They live under his blessing and protection. And they decide to go chasing after other gods. And it was one of those times, and what happens is God is quoted as saying, it was one of these times where they've gone worshiping other gods. And God actually talks about his protection. Because then they come to God saying, oh God, how come you haven't protected us? How come these people have overtaken us? How come we're being attacked? And God basically says, you know what? You worship those other gods. Go ask those other gods. Your God, small g, your God will protect you. You just have to choose which God you want to serve and receive protection. God protects his people. Be sure you're one of his people. Point number two, God protects those on his path. One of Jesus' most repeated invitations, I would even call it a command, but we don't typically hear it as a command, but I like this command. One of his most repeated commands is, follow me. Pretty simple, right? If you're following Jesus, you're going to kind of get all the rest of it there. He says, follow me. So often we hear commands as restricted. Oh, great, another rule, another command. Now, on top of all the struggles I have in life, now I have to follow Jesus. I know what that means, David. That's code language for don't do this and don't do that. And right? I don't see it as restricted. I see it as protected. Are you following me? Are you familiar with the military idea or concept of point man? But most of recent wars, because they've been fought in Middle Eastern deserts, we haven't heard much about the point man. But in jungle warfare, World War II, Southeast Asia, in Vietnam more recently, there was, as soldiers would walk through the jungle, they would walk single file. And they would take turns, either by assignment or by, there's actually some great stories of people, those voluntary point men. Whenever the captain of a troop, okay, we're going to go on patrol, who's going to run point man, there are stories of people who said, wow, that person always said, I'll run point. What that did in jungle warfare, the point man's job was to walk in the front. And in essence, whenever someone was assigned or voluntarily taking the job of point man, they were saying, if the enemy sees us, they will see me first. I will draw their fire. If there are landmines, if there are